Well, we are continuing our series entitled Power Struggle. We introduced it last week, and today we are continuing that series where I am challenging you to reject political power to change America. And instead, I'm challenging you to embrace the power you already have if you're a follower of Jesus. If you are a follower of Jesus, you already have power that can change more than any political power could change, because it can change human hearts. And when you change human hearts, you change society. Societal change is not contingent on who's in office. It's about the hearts of people, ultimately. So I've entitled our thoughts today, Cross the Aisle. And I want to talk to you today about the power of love. The power of love. I have an 80s Christian song in my head right now that I am really resisting singing right now. Keep going, Ken. Followers of Jesus have the power to activate love anytime they want. If you have ever been to a physical therapist, one of the things that they do is they teach you to concentrate on that area of your body that you need to work on. So, for instance, if they're wanting you to squeeze your shoulder blades together, they'll say that because they want you stretching and activating those muscles that cause those shoulder blades to move. That's exactly the way it is in your spiritual life. If you follow Jesus, at any moment, you can activate the supernatural power of God's love within you. And we're going to talk about that today and kind of develop that thought. We have the power, believe it or not, to love those who disagree with us or hate us or want to do us harm. We have that power. And so usually what happens is when something political comes up in conversation, we do not cross an aisle, but rather we stand on our side, we dig our heels in even deeper, and we believe that the person who's right is the person, and the person who can make the most change is the person who can shout the loudest. And Christian people do it just like the world. That's what we do. And I'm challenging you today to cross the aisle. And if I could put it in a simple phrase, you need to outlove the hate, and you have the power to outlove the hate in our culture. So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 5, and then we got one verse in John 13, and then, just a little bit, we'll get over to Matthew chapter 10. So Matthew chapter 5 is where we're going to start, verse 38. This is Jesus has started the Sermon on the Mount, and he's kind of just getting traction here as he gets to this section. Verse 38. You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you're sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. You've heard that the law says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. When Jesus came, he gave us his gospel, and his gospel offers to us not a political movement. He offers us an alternative to all political movements, because he offers us a way of life that will work in any political system. And that's important for us to understand. The gospel contains the power of love. The goal for you and me is not to win the upcoming election. Our goal as followers of Jesus is to win the lost. Jesus gave us his great commission, and that trumps politics. So let's talk first about the power of love, and then we're going to take a look at how we can practically love like Jesus. The power of love, Jesus shows us two things here about the power of love. Number one, the power of love behaves differently. As a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, it is important for you to not do things the way the world does them. Far too many people think that salvation, for instance, is just, well, I prayed a prayer on such and such a date, therefore I'm saved. If your life hasn't changed, nothing happened. Because true faith changes your heart, and when your heart changes, guess what else changes? All of your life, including your behavior. If you talk like the world, and you live like the world, and you sin like the world, you're not a Christian. You're not. Don't care how you label yourself. Jesus is clear that love is a lot like salvation. Salvation changes you. The love of God, when it gets a hold of your heart, it changes your life. Well, the love that we have toward other people, particularly our enemies, has the power to change them because we behave differently. Look at the examples that Jesus gave. He gave 3 of them there. He says, when violence is done to you, don't do what the world does. Somebody punches you in the face, don't cock back and give them one yourself. That's what the world does. Anybody can do that. Act different, behave differently. Why? Because you have the Spirit of God within you, and the Spirit of God is not the same as the Spirit of the world. He says, hey, if somebody takes you to court and they sue you and they take your shirt, voluntarily give them your coat as well. I know this troubles me greatly. And I think it troubles you too. This is what it means to behave differently. Jesus is introducing a different way of life. And the power of love does this. That when the person who takes that precious thing from us, what does Jesus say? Give them even more. That is very troubling to me. But God says, when you have my love, you can love people in that way. What does he say? He says, when the government imposes something on you, so in first century Jewish culture, any Roman soldier could come to any Jew and demand that that Jew carry his equipment. That's why Jesus used the example. And if they didn't, they were punished. So if the Roman soldier comes and he says, carry my gear for a mile, Jesus said, give him 2 miles. Now, friends, let's just elephant in the room. This is un-American. Because doggone, I got my guns. And if I'm faster than you on the draw, I'm going to shoot you down. Like, you're not going to pose nothing on me. I'm going to find me a tax break somewhere where I'm not going to have to pay you the taxes you're imposing on me. This is what we do. And Jesus says, if you follow me, you better behave differently because the power of my love within you will change you. It's the power of God's love. But the second thing that love does is it builds maturity in you. As you give love to others and behave differently toward them because of God's love, you become more like Jesus. When all I'm doing is standing on my side of the aisle trying to outshout the other person who disagrees with me on some hot-button political issue, first of all, that's the exact same thing that the world does, so they don't see Jesus in that. And I am actually not becoming more like Jesus, I'm becoming more like the world. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, right? Like, this is horrible. Ken, can we talk about something else? I wish we could. But we're talking about love right now, right? We're talking about love. And Jesus said, he said, it builds maturity. Now, he says there in verse 48, you are to be perfect even as your heavenly Father is perfect. Virtually all of the translations, not every single one of them, but the majority of them translate that Greek word perfect. But we know that sinless perfection is not what's being talked about here because that would be impossible. Christ never calls you to do something you can't do. He calls you to do what he will empower you to do. So what does perfect mean? Well, this word in the Greek that we translate perfect in our English Bibles, it carries with it the idea of bringing to wholeness without division, providing integrity. That's what happens when you love other people. You become like your Father. And so, while the enemy uses the tool of division to divide nations and households and friendships and families and all that kind of stuff, while he uses his division, Jesus says this is an opportunity for you politically. As we're in the home stretch towards the election, we have an incredible opportunity in front of us as children of God to behave differently than the world around us and to become more like Jesus, because Satan is giving us a silver platter of division, and we don't have to eat his pudding. We can take the opportunity to say, thank you, Satan, for the division. Now I'm going to become like Jesus. And when you become like Jesus, you'll overwhelm the resistance of the enemy. Who knew that politics could make me more like Jesus? It can, if you'll be unpolitical about it. And so we have this incredible opportunity to behave differently and to build maturity. Now let's go to Matthew chapter 10 as we kind of turn a slight corner here to talk about loving like Jesus. Now, what did Jesus say in John 13:35? I didn't get to that reference, but here's what he said. He said, all men will know you are my disciples by your love one for another. That's how powerful love is. So here in Matthew 10, let's read these first 6 verses of Matthew 10 as we learn to love like Jesus. Jesus called his 12 disciples together, gave them authority to cast out evil spirits, to heal every kind of disease and illness. Here are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also called Peter, then Andrew, Peter's brother, James, son of Zebedee, John, James' brother, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, the zealot, Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. Notice how these apostles are listed. So Jesus has followers, and after a period of time, he chooses these 12 to be a part of his inner circle. One is always identified. He's always listed last, and that is Judas, because he was the betrayer. They didn't even really want to list him, but they had to because he was one of the first 12, right? I mean, Judas who betrayed him. 9 of the disciples are listed in the typical Jewish first century way that you would identify somebody, through a family relationship, maybe an occupation, or to make a delineation between somebody else with the same name. 2 of them are identified explicitly by their politics. Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon, the zealot. So in first century Jewish culture, they all hated the Romans. Every Jew wanted the Romans gone. Get rid of them. We can't stand them. We hate them. It was just the Jews wanted the occupiers out. They wanted to have their homeland, the land of milk and honey that God had given to them. The Romans were there. Now, how do we get the Romans out? Every Jew always had that thought, and they always had those conversations, but they took different approaches. Some Jews believed that it was better if the Jews worked with the Romans to help get them out, and others believed that there was no way they would ever work with them. We're going to stand against them at all costs. And we read about these different groups all throughout the New Testament. For instance, those who cooperated with the Romans were ones like the Sadducees. The Sadducees dominated the Sanhedrin, which was the Romans allowed the Jews to have some political power of their own. The Sanhedrin is where that happened. These were spiritual people who were also in political offices like this, the Sadducees. And they were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. There we go. The Herodians, this was a group. Yeah, sorry, dad jokes are coming out. The Herodians, they also cooperated with the Romans. And what they did is they actually sided with the family of Herod. Herod's family, and that's just weird in and of itself, but as long as we work to keep Herod and his family happy, so we're going to cooperate because Herod's been put here by the Romans. And then there were the tax collectors who also worked with the Romans. Those who opposed the Romans were the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed if we can get to 50.1%, God will move the Romans out of Israel. And so we just need to get enough people believing like us, and once we do, God's going to take care of this whole mess, but we are not going to even taint ourselves. These were the spiritual leaders of Israel. No wonder Israel was a mess. There were the Sicarii, that was an assassins group, and there were the Zealots, and the Sicarii actually came from the Zealots. And so the Romans, like any conquering people, they wanted to extract taxes from those whose land they were living in. And so what they did is they found Jews to do the dirty work of collecting taxes. Matthew was one of these. He was hired by the Romans. He would go knock on a Jew's door, and there's a Jew standing on the opposite side of the door, not a Roman soldier clad in his military armor. It's a Jew coming to your door to take your money and give it to your hated enemy. This was treasonous to those on the other side of the aisle. And you can see why. In their book, The After Party, Curtis Chang and Nancy French tell us a little bit about the Zealots and the Romans and how things started. They say the Zealots had tried to revolt against the Romans, and they were bitterly opposed to the Roman tax policies. They also deeply resented those who collaborated with the Romans in their collection of taxes. I mean, if you knew that the person sitting on your left or right today worked for the IRS, would you be sitting there? I mean, just ask yourself that question. That'll tell me a lot about your heart. According to ancient historians, the Zealot movement was founded in Jesus' neighborhood when he was just a boy, about 6 A.D. Jesus was born, or the Zealots were formed. Judas of Galilee took a group of these politically motivated, hostile Jews, and he went to every Jewish tax collector's house that he could find, and he burned their homes, he took their stuff, and he pillaged them to let them know where he stood. He wrapped himself in the flag of Israel. Well, the Romans, part of their job was to protect the Jewish tax collectors. So the Romans went and found Judas of Galilee and his followers, and they put them to death. And with Judas, they crucified him, because the Romans reserved crucifixion primarily for political crimes. In fact, when Jesus was crucified, what did they label him as? The King of the Jews. That's a political statement. And so they crucified Judas, and basically what the Romans were saying was, you will do things our way or you will die. And it was their way of keeping the Jews in line. Well, Jesus has walked with people who are following him, and he comes to Matthew chapter 10, and he says, I'm going to choose 12 of you. And he deliberately and on purpose found two men at the extreme ends of the political spectrum, and he said, you can both follow me. Man, I have gone to meddling, and some of you want to use the bathroom right now. Some of you really hate what I'm saying, and I'm okay with that, because it bothers me too. But I want to be on Jesus' side, and I think you do too. Jesus chooses Simon and Matthew. And so how do we love like Jesus? Number one, you got to invite your enemies to your table. Invite your enemies to your table. Do you ever wonder if Simon, when he came into the room, well, first of all, who was first? And whichever one was second to come into the room the first time, do you think that maybe they were like, Jesus, I'd like to now reject your invitation. I just don't think I can work with this. Do you wonder if Jesus, when he was putting the nameplates out like your mom does at the Thanksgiving dinner? Now, some of you are like me, and when she's not looking, you rearrange them so you can sit where you want. I wonder if Jesus ever did that, and I wonder how often he had Simon and Matthew sitting right next to each other. Probably not very often initially, because Simon would have known how to kill Matthew. In fact, the Sicarii, the assassins group, the Zealots may have been plundered by the Romans after their initial attempt to deal with the tax collectors. They just basically went underground. They became black market assassins. And the Sicarii were so highly trained, they loved to find a large group of people, a mob where Roman soldiers were. They learned how the Roman soldiers put their armor on. They learned the length of the dagger that they would need for the size of the individual, and they were trained to sneak in quietly and discreetly, wield their dagger in the crowd, slide that dagger up between the ribs of the Roman soldier, and pierce his heart and kill him while they walked away, and nobody knew what happened. This is Simon seated at the table of Jesus. And he hates the employers of Matthew, and he sees Matthew just like a Roman. I mean, imagine that. And Matthew's an extortionist. He's an IRS agent. Most of us in the room want to abolish the IRS. It's so loud in here I can hardly hear myself. That word enemies, that word for enemies there that Jesus uses, love your enemies. It means somebody that you oppose, somebody that you are at enmity with. And friends, we don't invite our enemies to the table to change them. We don't invite our enemies to the table to inform them. We invite our enemies to the table to love them. Because we're not looking for political power, we're looking for the power of love. And aren't you sick and tired of seeing everything that doesn't work? I'll tell you one thing that does work is when you love your enemy, even if it costs you your life. Jesus' prayer with his last breaths on this earth before his death was that the Roman soldiers who were gambling for his clothes would find faith in him. You can only pray that kind of prayer because you love them. You got to invite your enemies to your table. Number two, you need to work for their good. If we're going to love like Jesus, we have to work for their good. The goal is not to win the person. The goal is not to win the position, it's to win the person. We're not trying to win our position, we're trying to win the person. Love here, as it's translated in Matthew chapter 5, love your enemies. It refers to generous, warm, costly self-sacrifice on behalf of the other individual. Do you want to give warm, costly, self-sacrificing love to somebody who is the other color of you politically, red or blue, wherever you land? Only when you love like Jesus will you be where you need to be. Are you willing to give your life for the person across the aisle? I'm telling you, that's how Jesus expects you to love. And our media feeds the hate. They feed the hate, and we buy it, we drink it. Me too. I like it when it's a little sweet. It's got a little color to it. I don't know how you like yours, but we all drink it. And we got to stop. We got to work for their good. Love your enemies. Jesus said, so what if you're kind to the people that you love? Even wicked people do that. True love comes when you are able from the depth of your heart to look at your enemy, to look at that person who opposes you, who wants to do away with you, who can't stand you, when your greatest interest for their life is that they would be well off, that they would be blessed, that you could serve them. And thirdly, we need to pray for them. Pray for those who persecute you. Talk to God about them. Talk to God about them. Praying consistently for people from the heart is an expression of love for them. I think this is why Paul, and we'll get to this in a later message, this is why Paul told Timothy to exhort people to pray for all who are in authority over you. Kings and governors, everybody. Pray for them. Why? Because when you pray, God changes your heart, and God will never change your heart to hate. He'll always change your heart to love. That's how God changes us. And so maybe we need to stop looking at the people on our side of the aisle, and we need to start getting a list of names from the other side of the aisle, and we need to begin to take those names before the throne of God. Because God, if I'm honest before you today without any lying, these are my enemies. And I wish to God that they didn't exist, and I hate their policies, and I hate everything about them. Sometimes that's what's in our hearts. And we need to not only invite them to the table and work for their good, but we need to pray for them. We've got to remember, Jesus said, listen, remember that these are not, get beyond the political enemy. Can you see them as a human being? They're dealing with things in their personal life that you know nothing about. And do you even care? Do I even care? Jesus cares. He cares. And he's not going to appear and show his love. He's expecting you and I to show his love to them. Jesus said, it rains on the just and the unjust. This last Wednesday, it rained a little bit. We got a little shower. I want you to know that there are people who hate God in central Montana, and it rained all day on them. And people like me that love God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength, it rained on me too. And the sun rose this morning not just so that people of God could get up out of bed. The sun also rose, and there are thousands of people who have no interest in God all across central Montana who also got up because the common grace of God, the sun came up through their windows as well. Stop seeing people as political enemies and see them as God sees them. These are people. They are people. And they need the love of God. And when we behave like the world, we are dragging the name of Christ through the mud. And at some point we have to repent of that sin. Love is a power that is available to you today, and we know this because of Galatians 5:22. Galatians 5:22 says, the fruit of the Spirit, the evidence of the Holy Spirit at work in your life is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, meekness, self-control, all of them. The fruit, the evidence that God is at work in you is love. Flex that, work that love. Has it started to atrophy in your life? Can it even move? Do you have any dexterity there? You can grab that Connect card as we prepare to close today. And mark whichever box is appropriate. You can drop these into any of our Connect boxes. There's one on the door frame as you leave this room, one down by the front doors. But maybe you need to give your life to Christ today. Mark that box. Maybe it's that second box. I need to pray for those who differ from me politically. Or maybe it's, I need to change my behavior. Whatever it is, if you'll drop that into the Connect card box, we'll be praying for you today. Believe me. I've been praying for myself because, friends, I've been caught in the political undertow, and I want to change. And this is a journey of transformation that we have the opportunity to join. I'm going to ask the worship team if they'd return at this time and prepare to close us with one final song. John MacArthur wrote a great book many years ago. Don't always agree with him theologically, but I love his book, 12 Ordinary Men. Where he basically profiles the 12 disciples. And John MacArthur writes this. He says, several sources say that after the destruction of Jerusalem, Simon the Zealot took the gospel north and preached to the British Isles. This man who was once willing to kill or be killed for a political agenda within the confines of Judea found a more fruitful cause for which to give his life in the proclamation of salvation for sinners out of every nation, tongue, and tribe. And that includes the Romans. Now I want you to just think about that for a minute. Think of it, Simon the Zealot, this man who was so politically motivated, invited to the table of Jesus for a short period of time. And the power of the love of Jesus helped him to see that political power is never going to change the world. But the love of Jesus can. And Simon ends up going north, gets to the British Isles with the gospel. About 1,800 years later, there was a nation called Great Britain, and there was a bunch of colonies in what we now know as America. And those 13 colonies were fighting for freedom from Great Britain, the British Isles. I want you to pause and just think for a second about how Jesus can change your life. It was because of Simon the Zealot that you, as an American citizen, have come to faith in Christ. How about that? Not because his politics were right or honest all the time, not because his heart was right, because we know it wasn't, but because he chose to use the power of love rather than the power of politics to try to bring change. Fascinating. Jesus' plan began by crossing the aisle, finding two political enemies and bringing them to the same table so that he could change their life. He took two divided people, amongst others, and he showed them the power of love. And as you prepare to leave this place today, that is my challenge to you. That you will find people that are politically divided from you, that you will fixate on them, not for political motivations or reasons, but that you will say, Jesus, give me your heart to love them like you. I don't care how they vote, but I do care that they're in heaven. So help me, Jesus. I challenge you to cross the aisle, and you can do it with the love of God. Will you stand with us?